What is American is an independent judiciary and checks and balances on power. But this goes back to the campaign where the Trump machine works best if there is an other, right? And if they can't have a Hillary Clinton or they can't have the media, which is daily, they need something.
That's absolutely right. And if you look back at the campaign, going back to the campaign, this is also kind of the role that Don Jr. has pretty regularly played. That of the members of the Trump family, he is the one who is most out there with the sort of deep state conspiracy theories, the media, anti-Trump media conspiracy theories. He was the one who made those comments, comparing refugees to poisoned candy. Right. So he's the guy in the family who says this stuff. Often the stuff that his father thinks or says to other people privately, but doesn't quite say out loud. And I think you do need to see this as part of that pattern of behavior. I will say, in fairness to Don Jr., he's not wrong that there are plenty of people on the civil service side of government or on the, who were appointed by President Obama into senior roles in government, who absolutely didn't want his dad to succeed as president and who represented real roadblocks early in the administration. At this stage, when you are talking about things like an independent investigation, independent judiciary, it's a much more provocative thing to say. Yeah, and look, what Michael Hayden said is striking, right? An appeal to the heart of autocracy. This is from somebody who used to run the CIA. Mm-hmm. That's, not subtle language. And it's really just, this is about just simply what Don Jr. is saying, what he believes, what presumably the Trump family talks about is they're counterpunching, there's a conspiracy to get them, that's the purpose that gets them up in the morning, and these are folks who, quote, don't want America to be America again. Working in the federal government, civil service, that's really troubling. And it echoes old talks, right, about, in the 1950s, people in the State Department trying to undermine American independence, secretly siding with the Soviet. So there are ugly overtones, and it may just be a dog whistle, but it's indicative of a mode of thinking that should be troubling. But I think that what Alex is saying is an interesting road to go down. I think that it's an interesting exercise to sometimes try to get into the mind of Don Jr. and the base and figure out what it is they're thinking. So what they're saying, let's just play this exercise for a second, is that there are people in the Department of Justice, this is how you interpret it, maybe the CIA, maybe the FBI, who could stop the president, who could stop the president's agenda somehow. I think he's saying something much more than that. I think what he's saying is that there are people who don't want America to succeed working in the federal government, who don't want America to be America again. Whatever that means, it's some glory restoration that for whatever partisan or identity politics reason they feel is being actively blocked.
They're working against America somehow from inside.
Yeah, and I think it's not just working against a political agenda. I think he's alleging basically a conspiracy to stop his father. Remember, the rigged system rift begins during the campaign. And there are elements like the rigged system of redistricting, which are designed to blunt representative democracy. That's not this. But President Trump won. He is head of the federal government. So it's a neat judo move to say that the head of the federal government is being a victim of a conspiracy theory by the federal government. Another interesting angle on the Russian investigation came yesterday when Christie gave an interesting comment. He's winding down his last days in the New York, or the New Jersey governor mansion there. And do we have that on tape? Do we want to hear what he said? Yeah, let's listen. Let's listen to what he said when asked about whether Jared Kushner should be a reasonable target of this investigation.
He deserves a scrutiny. You know why? Because he was involved in the transition and involved in meetings that call into question his role.
Now, he did qualify it a little bit and say if he's guilty, it's whatever. But this goes back. This is an intriguing family story because he helped put Jared's dad in prison.
He was largely responsible for putting Jared's dad in jail. And then to repay the favor, Jared was in no small part responsible for ousting Chris Christie from the transition and really taking over that process. And look, there is a personal grudge side of this. Make no mistake about it. But Chris Christie, he has a point that if Jared and the Trump kids had not sort of shunted him aside and taken command of the transition themselves, I don't know that Jared would be facing the kind of legal scrutiny that he is right now. I don't know that he would have been in a position to have those meetings that we know that Special Counsel Mueller is now looking into.
Because Governor Christie thinks like a prosecutor.
Right.
As opposed to a real estate scion.
Right, and that's a good reason why typically children and family members of presidents don't run transitions. But the intergenerational bad blood is fascinating here. And it's not just that Christie got dumped from the transition because of this. It's that, he was really about to be Trump's VP. That's what Trump had wanted. That was the bet for the early endorsement. And that was kiboshed in no small part because of that interpersonal battle.
What a tangled web.
Oh, yeah. No, it's fascinating.
Honestly, this is. And it's just interesting. It's notable because Chris Christie is freed. I mean, Chris Christie has never been that hamstrung to say what he really feels. He's, sort of prides himself on being a bit of a straight talker, but now he's truly freed if he's stepping out of politics.
And he's really one of the few people in the party who is both free to speak his mind and take shots at the party, and the president listens to him. You're not talking about a John Kasich here who's just sort of out there, whacking the White House every day.
And he's really grabbed the opioid epidemic as the cause of the day. It'll be interesting what his second act might be.
Absolutely. All right, stay tuned for all of that. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Alex Burns, John Avalon, great to see you. All right, we do have some breaking news for you out of Italy. The former cardinal from Boston, who was accused of protecting abusive priests, has died. The stained legacy of Bernard Law in a live report from Rome for you next.
You too. All right, a new CNN poll shows a growing number of Americans oppose the Republicans' tax reform bill as the House is set to vote on the measure today. President Trump's approval numbers also at an all-time low in our polls. CNN political director David Chalian live in Washington with the numbers. What do you see?
Good morning, Chris. That's right. Only about a third of Americans favor this tax bill that the House of Representatives is poised to pass today. Take a look at our latest numbers in our CNN poll, a poll conducted by SSRS, at the opposition to the plan. 55% of Americans, a majority of those polled here, say they are opposed to the tax plan, and that opposition has grew 10 points in the last month. That's quite a big jump. And if you look at it by party, Chris, opposition grew among Republicans, independents, and Democrats. You see it there from 7% to 13% among Republicans, up 12 points in opposition among Indies, up 10 points among Democrats. I should say support for the bill among Republicans grew even more than opposition did. So it's not that all Republicans are opposed, but we see opposition growing across all categories. And then, of course, we ask the question, which is, does this plan benefit the wealthy or the middle class? You know that it is the argument of Republicans and the president that it's a middle class tax cut. It seems to be an argument that the American people aren't buying. 2/3, 66% say this bill is going to benefit the wealthy. Only 27% say it's going to help the middle class. We also asked about the president's family. How will the Trump family fare in this bill? Well, overwhelmingly, Americans think that the Trump family is going to be better off. 63% say better off, only 5% say worse off, 25% say the same. You mentioned the president's approval rating as well, and you're right, we have a new approval rating number for him, 35% approval. That's a numerical low in all of CNN's polling throughout the year of Donald Trump's presidency, 59% disapprove. And if you stack that up in history, Chris, you know that Donald Trump is at the bottom at this point in the presidency compared to all of his modern era predecessors.
And look, this is just a starting point. Low number could lead him to some easy success because he's starting from such a low point, and guys with low numbers got reelected in the past. It's certainly not over, but it is a moment in time worth noting. David, thank you very much. In fact, you're so good, stick around. And let's bring in, to join David, Chris Cillizza, reporter and editor-at-large at CNN Politics. The wisdom of the people. Where do they have it wrong, Chris Cillizza? This tax plan does over-benefit the rich relative to the middle class. It will benefit the Trump family. I'm surprised the numbers aren't even higher than that.
Look, I think that you have a huge perception problem if you're the Republican Party. What it reminds me of, these numbers remind me of, and what I know we'll hear from the Trump people is exactly what the Obama folks said after the Affordable Care Act passed, which is, look, people don't know what's in it. Once they start realizing that these scary things that the other side is saying aren't true, it's going to get more popular. It's hard to see how that happens because President Trump, at least at the moment, is not a good messenger. Not nationally. Still an okay messenger in the Republican Party, but 35% is not a good messenger nationally. The hope here is that when these tax benefits start to go, when people say, oh, I get more money back, that is enough to change perception about this. Look, they knew this. This is not news to them. They are placing a huge gamble that this tax cut plan will be something that they can take to voters, not just the Republican base, but the Republican base, and say, we did this, we accomplished something, we brought real change. This is a large, you've heard Donald Trump say it 1,000 times, this is the largest overall of the tax code in history. It's a gamble. I think they knew it. They believed it was better than the alternative, which was basically having zero major legislative accomplishments in the first year of a Republican president and total Republican control of Congress.
David, are Republicans privately worried about these poll numbers? Are they expressing concern privately that this gambit, that they're hoping that when people live the tax plan, they learn to love it, but there's no guarantee of that before the midterms?
Republicans privately are most concerned about the president's poll numbers, Republicans on Capitol Hill, rather than these particular numbers on the bill. As Chris is saying, they do believe that Americans will start to see some benefit and perceptions may change. More importantly, the numbers that have been concerning them for much of the year in talking to Republicans are the ones about how their own fellow Republicans are judging them, and those numbers were going down. Republicans across the country were so angry and disappointed with Republican control of Congress that they weren't following through on full repeal of Obamacare, on the major promises that they had made, that Republicans were so fearful of that. That's the political imperative Chris was just talking about, that Republicans really felt they had to be able to go back home and say, we got something we said we were going to get done, and we want to get some credit from our own team for that.
And the problem, though, Chris, is just to set the context. This isn't what the president promised. What the president promised was, hey, little guy, hey, woman who's struggling, single mom who voted for me, even though there was some ugly stuff out there about me, working man, coal miner man, struggling family, I'm your guy. I don't need their money. I know their games. I don't need to play them. I'm for you. This deal is not set up to advantage that group more than other groups. I'm not saying that people don't get tax cuts within those brackets. How much, how long, those are variable. But why didn't he do that?
Well, the reality of trying to pass a broad overhaul of the tax code is not easy. That's why. Because...
Why didn't he do a targeted middle-class tax cut? He would have had Democrats on board.
He can't, look, David's point is the right one on this, Chris. You need the Republican base. You need the Republican Party. You need the rank and file of Republicans to be the votes for this. I understand, yes. Could they have got, look, I always remind people, 10 Democratic senators are up for re-election next year in states that Donald Trump won. 5 of those in states he won by double digits. In theory, you say we want to do a middle tax plan. Can we bring those people in? In theory, you can craft something that brings some of them
Joe Manchin was spelling it out to us yesterday.
Joe Manchin, Joe Donnelly, Heidi Heitkamp. I mean, there's a lot of people who would be available for that. They did not go that route, believing that ultimately Democrats would not be for them, and they needed something for the Republican base. You could say it's a narrow cast strategy, and it is, but I would remind you, what is the thing that we saw in both the Virginia governor's election and the Alabama Senate election over the last few months? A less than enthusiastic Republican base up against an incredibly enthused Democratic base. The midterm elections are base elections. It's not a presidential election where your casual person votes. This is your base vote. They believe this is the only means to get that. Why did Donald Trump not do it? Because he wanted to get something passed, Chris. He wanted to get something passed. He knew he had to do it with primarily Republican support, and that's the route they take. Again, huge gamble. Huge gamble, politically speaking.
Okay. I would also add, sorry, Allison, I would just also add that I think there's a philosophical piece to this, too, which is that philosophically, Republicans believe if you skew this more towards corporations, that there will be a trickle-down effect in the economy. So there is a belief in skewing it the way that it is going to help everyone, Chris.
Okay, next topic. Judge Gorsuch. The Washington Post has interesting new reporting about what was happening in the White House and in President Trump's brain when Judge Gorsuch went and sat down, as you'll remember, with Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat of Connecticut, and Judge Gorsuch admitted that he found the attacks on the other judge of Hispanic origin to be demoralizing. Okay, he said it. He was quite honest about his feelings about it, and President Trump was silent at that time, at least in public, about what Gorsuch was saying. But now, if you peel back the curtain, we know, David, that in fact he was seething. So much so that he had told colleagues that he was considering rescinding the nomination.
This is classic Donald Trump, right? I feel like we should take this story and just clip it and put it in some time capsule if you just want to understand Donald Trump's psyche. Here's his guy that is going to be his biggest win of the year and get conservatives in a really happy place about the Trump presidency early on. And all of a sudden, he's getting personally offended by the fact that Gorsuch is sort of playing his politics and expressing his real opinion to make sure that he doesn't roil the waters of confirmation. And Trump, of course, is willing to pull it. Now, the White House in the story says he was never willing to pull it, of course. But look at Donald Trump's behavior over time. It is all about Donald Trump. So even your Supreme Court nominee, if he is the one that is saying something that you think is against the grain and somehow offends you, it doesn't matter. You're more upset about that than you are necessarily in this one moment about getting him on the court.
Yeah, it's classic can't see the forest through the trees, right? I mean, to David's point, like the reason Gorsuch was saying and doing those things was because he wanted to make sure that senators didn't think he was just an ironclad rubber stamp for Donald Trump.
His independence.
Like every judicial nominee, Democrat or Republican picked, does this. Like, well, I'm not going to do what Barack Obama says. I'm not going to do what Donald Trump says. So it is in support of the broader strategy which Donald Trump wanted, which was Neil Gorsuch on the court. It's just the inability to, the misunderstanding of the fact that just because you appointed this person does not mean they are required to express total fealty to you at all times, even to the want of strategic positioning, which is what Gorsuch was trying. He was trying to help Trump's case here. I mean, that's what's remarkable. This is like, you look up cut off your nose to spite your face. Like it's Donald Trump being annoyed at Neil Gorsuch. He eventually got what he wanted, but
don't cloud this with nuance.
You're right. If you look up, David is right, you look up Trumpian in the dictionary, like this is the anecdote that is you get told.
Chris, David, thank you very much.
All right, so we saw a senator act like a New Day anchor when he was interviewing a federal judicial candidate. This Senator Kennedy took on this judicial nominee and really exposed some huge deficiencies under testing. We're going to talk to Senator John Kennedy about why he did that, what the fallout has been, and what does he think about this tax bill. His state is going to be very sensitive on these issues, and I'll tell you why I use that word when we come to Republicans in the House are set to vote on the final version of their tax plan today. The Senate is expected to get the bill to the president's desk by tomorrow. Our new CNN poll shows 55% of you oppose this bill. What is that going to mean to senators? Joining us now is Republican Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. Senator, always a pleasure.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
So you know the poll numbers. I don't have to tell you about that. What does that mean to the people in your state? How do you sell this tax plan to them?
I tell them the truth, the good part and the bad part. I think the poll numbers are a reflection of a couple of things. I think any reasonable person would look at the media coverage, and media's done its job, and most of the media has been negative. I'm not fussing about that, but it's just a fact. Number two, the bill has changed a lot. I think a lot of folks don't really understand yet what's in it, not because they're not smart, but because it's just changed. I mean, I've probably spent, 300 hours on this legislation trying to keep up with the changes. But I'll tell you this, the conference committee report made this bill better. Senator Rubio, Senator Lee, in my opinion, did the American people a great service by increasing the child tax credit. We cleaned up some of the problems. For example, we're not going to tax tuition waivers for graduate students. We're not going to remove teachers' deduction for out-of-pocket spending on classroom materials. We're going to expand parents' ability to use a 529 program. A lot of the stuff that never made sense to me.
Right.
We cleaned up, and once folks learn that, they'll be appreciative.
Yeah, Senator, I think that the fundamental problem here was not one of your making. This was sold as being something that would be designed to advantage the middle class the most. And it is very difficult to look at this bill's architecture and see it that way, not just because of what you just pointed out that needed to be fixed, but the theory here seems to be pretty obvious. We will help the top tier the most because we believe that they, in turn, will help the middle class. That's the sell on this. It's not that we are advantaging the middle class as the president promised, and we're going to put it on the backs of the rich, let them pay even more. That's not what was done.
A couple of points. You make a good one, but a couple of points. I don't think you ought to make tax policy on the basis of class warfare. I think you ought to make tax policy on the basis of sound economic principles. Number two, this bill does help ordinary people. Doubling the standard deduction, doubling the child tax credit, lowering the tax rates. Number three, what helps American people the most is giving them access to a quality job. I think this bill will do that. It's going to cut taxes on every single business, and there are two impacts of that haven't been talked about a lot. Number one, I think it's going to increase foreign direct investment by 50%. A lot of out of this country capital is going to come into America. Number two, when we allow small business people to expense their new buildings and equipment and software rather than depreciate them, that's going to help their business grow. What does that mean? That means that they're going to add workers, add jobs.
Maybe.
That means, well, I believe it will.
I know. I'm not saying you don't believe it, but they're maybes, Senator. They're maybes.
I can see that. But as you add jobs, wage pressure is going to go up. And the other impact of buying that new software, workers are going to become more productive. The real problem with wages, Chris, has been that our productivity growth ought to be about 2%. For the past 8 years, it's been 1%. Right. And given our demographics, we're all getting older. We're not adding workers, so we got to make the current workers more productive before you see a wage increase. And that's a long-winded way of saying that I believe, if I'm wrong, I'll come back on your show and say I was wrong and here's why. But I believe that a rising tide does lift all boats. This isn't a zero-sum game. You don't make the middle class better by making the upper middle class poorer or vice versa. We all ought to rise together.
No, I hear you. It's just at the end of the day, there are a lot of maybes in there, and I'm not going to say that you're wrong about them because I don't have any better data about the future than you do. But the corporate tax cuts are permanent. The ones for individuals and the families of people who put you in office are temporary.
You're right.
And that's because there was a preference given to the corporations that the individuals didn't get. I know there are reasons for that, but that's going to be something they're going to have to swallow.
Well, 2 points. Number one, I would have liked to have made the personal income tax cuts permanent, but as you know, we had the $1.5 trillion guardrail. Number two, President Bush's tax cuts were temporary too.
Right.
They were renewed, and I feel very confident, no matter who's in power, that these tax cuts for ordinary people will be renewed. I honestly believe that this bill is going to add between 0.5 point and a full point to gross domestic product, and you're going to see foreign direct investment go up 50%. If I'm wrong, I'll admit you're right. Economic forecasting is more art than science.
No, I don't. Listen, just to be clear about one thing, Senator. I don't want to be right about this. I'm just saying that
I don't want you to be right either.
You have to question the priorities and the choices that are made. That's my only point. But while I have
Fair point.
I do have to point out your questioning of a judge nominee that took place. Let me play a little bit for people to remind them of what was happening.
Have you ever tried a jury trial?
I have not.
Civil?
No.
Criminal?
No.
Bench?
No.
State or federal court?
I have not.
Do you know what a motion in limine is?
I would probably not be able to give you a good definition right now.
Do you know what the Younger abstention doctrine is?
I've heard of it, but
how about the Pullman abstention doctrine?
I heard.
You'll all see that a lot in federal court. Okay.
Senator, Did you anticipate taking this man down the way you did when you went in there?
No, sir. Look, I had read Mr. Peterson's FBI background check. He's a very smart guy. He's honest, lots of integrity, but he doesn't have any trial experience, and that's what a trial judge, federal district court judge does. I think the president has made some outstanding appointments to the federal judiciary. Nobody's perfect. My job on the Judiciary Committee is to help catch mistakes that might come through. And I just don't, I say this respectfully, but I just don't think Mr. Peterson is ready to be a trial judge. I don't think they were gotcha questions. Your clip didn't show this, but one of the questions I asked him about the Doe-Bear case. I say Doe-Bear. Some say Dober, but I'm from Louisiana. We say Doe-Bear.
Right.
That's like Marbury versus Madison.
Right. It's about whether or not, when you have the exceptions to when a federal court will review state court decisions, and it carved out certain things, as did Pullman. I get it. I get why you were asking the questions. I was just shocked at the answers. I mean, motion in limine is something you learn in law school. It was weird. Now, is it true that the president contacted you to say, what did he say?
He called me Friday. He said, look, Kennedy, do your job, man. I'm not upset. He said, do your job. He said, what do you think we ought to do? And I said, Mr. President, I would ask Mr. Peterson to step down. I don't want to see him suffer anymore. And he said, I think that's what we'll do. And he said, just keep doing your job. And I said, I really appreciate that, Mr. President. And then I said, I understand you don't interview these candidates. I brought it up. He didn't, and he doesn't. Presidents don't interview federal district court judge nominees. They're busy doing other stuff. But I said, look, I appreciate it, Mr. President. And then we started talking about taxes. We talked about tax reform mostly.
Well, Senator, that was really classic what you did there. I was joking before the segment. I'm really not joking. You could be a New Day anchor the way you were interviewing that judge nominee. It was really interesting, and I liked your line about how watching My Cousin Vinny doesn't qualify you to be a federal judge. It's good that you put that controversy to rest.
It wasn't personal, and let me say again, I think Mr. Peterson's a very smart guy, and he's very capable, but you're smart too, Chris, but I wouldn't ask you to transplant a kidney in the morning. Experience matters.
You are a wise man, Senator Kennedy, especially if it was your kidney that we were talking about. I wouldn't ask you to do that too. Listen, the best to you and your family for Christmas. You are an enduring example of how people can disagree, they can have different ideas, but they can do it with decency. And you prove that time and again on this show, and you are always welcome here.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks a lot.
All right. The best to you, sir. Allison.
TV News.
Translate your kidney?
Translate it. No. TV News
What's it called when you take it out? Transplant?
Transplant.
I could take
Let's start with that.
I could take a kidney out. The person wouldn't survive, but I could take a kidney
with
out.
your bare hands?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
just with my look. Kidneys just fall out of people.
I am okay. I was gonna describe that feeling.
I'll teach you. I'll teach you how to do it. It's great fun at parties.
They say it's not brain surgery or kidney surgery, but here we go. Here's more TV news for you. President Trump lays out his national security plan, pushing his America First policies, what the president said and what he did not say that has one senator's attention. That's next.
You're smart, but I wouldn't ask you to transplant.
I'm Dave Briggs. New day starts right now. We'll try and see you tomorrow and do better.
We'll be better tomorrow. We'll be better tomorrow, I promise.
This is CNN Breaking News.
We want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. This is New Day. It is Wednesday, December 20th, 6 o'clock here in New York. Chris is off. Bill Weir joins me. Great to have you here on this very busy day.
Busy day. Great to be with you, my friend.
Great to have you. Okay, so a landmark overhaul of the nation's tax code now just hours away from reaching the president's desk. The Senate passing the GOP bill overnight. The last undeclared Republican, Jeff Flake, voting yes. The House expected to follow suit today in a re-vote approving this bill that polls show is deeply unpopular with the American people. President Trump already spiking the football, praising what he calls the biggest tax cut in history. He plans to hold a news conference at the White House this afternoon.
And with all eyes on the tax bill, a looming government shutdown is flying under the radar somewhat, unless a spending bill is passed before midnight Friday. funds for federal agencies run dry. Several Senate sources are telling CNN a short-term stopgap measure may be their best hope. And Donald Trump Jr., trying to discredit the Russia investigation into his father's administration, tells a group of young conservative activists that the probe surrounding Dad's campaign is being fueled by government higher-ups conspiring to block his political agenda. Lots going on, and CNN has it all covered, of course, with Joe Johns live at the White House to start us off. Joe.
Good morning, Bill. The White House is pushing toward a media event here later today to celebrate passage of the tax bill. The White House early reaction to congressional movement was to start recounting the other things the administration sees as successes during the first year of President Trump. However, make no mistake, this is the first major legislative victory during the Trump administration, coming just 11 days from the end of the year.
The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is passed.
Senate Republicans celebrating after passing the first overhaul of the U.S. tax code in 30 years along strict party lines.
The Democrats have said that the American people will remember this night. I hope they do.
This country will be moving forward again.
The early morning vote, which was interrupted by protesters, coming amid fierce objections from Democrats who attacked the $1.5 trillion bill for disproportionately helping corporations and wealthy Americans. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer chastising Republicans for talking in the chamber during his closing argument.
Can we have order, Mr. President?
The Senate will be in order.
This is serious stuff. We believe you're messing up America. You could pay attention for a couple of minutes.
Ohio Democrat Sherrod Brown prompting a rebuke about decorum from an aide to Majority Leader McConnell following this moment during the Senate debate.
This tax cut raises, it causes a huge budget deficit to give money to the wealthiest people in the country, creates a huge hole in the budget, and who's going to fill the hole in the budget? Not the lobbyists walking in and out of Senator McConnell's office 100 feet down the hall.
CNN polling shows the bill is unpopular with the majority of Americans, but Republicans remain convinced that once the legislation is enacted, public perception will improve.
If we can't sell this to the American people, we ought to go into another line of work.
Earlier in the day, the House also passed the tax bill with every Democrat and 12 Republicans voting no.
The conference report is adopted without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
But after the vote, the Senate parliamentarian found 3 small provisions that violated budget rules, meaning the House will have to revote on the bill later today.
To me, it's emblematic of what happens when you take major legislation, conceive of it in the dark, and rush it through.
After likely passing again in the House, the bill will be sent to the desk of President Trump. He congratulated Republicans in both chambers after their votes. Due to changes in the estate tax and the alternative minimum tax, the president is likely to benefit greatly from this bill, despite insisting otherwise.
This is going to cost me a fortune, this thing. Believe me. This is not good for me.
Press Secretary Sarah Sanders repeating these claims Tuesday before conceding Mr. Trump could benefit.
In some ways, particularly on the personal side, the president will likely take a big hit, but on the business side, he could benefit.
There is one more issue for the Congress to deal with before they leave town for the Christmas holiday. That would be a spending bill to avoid a partial government shutdown. Several sources tell CNN the only scenario at this stage is yet another continuing resolution, short term, of course, to keep the government up and running. Bill and Allison, back to you.
Okay, Joe, thank you very much for all of that reporting. Let's bring in our CNN political analysts to talk about it. We have John Avlon and Alex Burns. Okay, so let's tell our viewers what made the final cut. I mean, what's actually in this thing. So let's start by telling you what's in it for individuals. Okay, let's take you through it. So it lowers most individual rates. It nearly doubles the standard deduction. If you take that deduction, it eliminates the personal exemptions. You don't have to itemize. It caps state and local tax deductions at a rate that is, quite frankly, lower for
10 grand.
Few states.
Yeah.
Right, 10 grand. And so for people in California, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, that doesn't fly with them. It eliminates the health insurance mandate for businesses. Let's go through that. It slashes the corporate tax rate. That's the cherry on top here that everybody has been, ballyhooing.
Down to 21%?
Right, yeah.
From 35.
From 35. It lowers the tax burden on pass-through businesses. This will come up because that is how President Trump and people like Jared Kushner, who have these pass-through real estate businesses, can become enriched. It changes how U.S. multinational corporations are taxed. Okay, John, where are we? What do you see in the final product?
Well, look, I mean, this is Republicans. They've gotten the win they desperately wanted and needed. President Trump does as well. This bill is less bad than some of the original provisions, but it is fundamentally a corporate tax cut under the belief that that will have a broad stimulative effect and finally raise wages on Main Street, which have been lagging. Problem is there's no guarantee it will do that. The problem is that it will balloon the deficit. The problem is that it's been sold as a middle-class tax cut primarily and tax simplification, and it really isn't either of those things. Those are significant problems. It could increase income inequality. It could also bring in a broad new era of corporate profit that trickles down to Main Street America. Let's hope that's the case.
That would be proving trickle-down economics, John.
Some folks are still fighting that.
But what's interesting, Alex, as you talked about, is the individual tax cuts, which people will see in the near term. A few $100, most of the people will see that, expires in 8 years. The corporate tax cuts are forever. A cynic would say some of the folks on Capitol Hill were looking at their career longevity and doing the math on whether they would pay the price of this. But what's really interesting is the behind-the-scenes machinations from Republicans. When repealing Obamacare blew up in their faces, a lot of people thought this would be a Christmas miracle. So talk us through what happened to get to this point.
Well, behind the scenes on the Hill, this has been just an absolute must-pass piece of legislation, really all year, but especially since the failure of Obamacare. This sense among congressional leaders that failure was not an option, that they had to negotiate their way to 51 votes in the Senate to 218 in the House. I guess a little less than 218 now, since so many people have resigned. You did have a number of off-site negotiations of a kind that you don't typically have in the middle of a major legislative process.
That was to keep people from going rogue and killing the bill in the cradle, right? To the press.
Right, and that, frankly, for this Republican conference, especially in the House, is an enormous accomplishment, that we have not seen this majority pass anything of scale that had a chance of actually becoming law ever, right? that they have every...
Tọa lạc tại cửa ngõ phía nam của trung tâm thành phố, Sky Central tự hào là dự án.
President Obama would veto it, or that it would not clear the Republican Senate. So that has given folks in the Freedom Caucus and on the more moderate side of the House a lot of leeway to kind of freelance or vote for things that they wouldn't actually have to answer for in front of voters. This one was different, and they managed the process. We heard Brian Schott, the senator from Hawaii, talking about a bill conceived in the dark, negotiated in private. You take away those sort of procedural choices that Republicans made, and I don't know that this thing ever gets this far.
One of the lawmakers said not everything that you hear in the dark is Santa Claus. One of the Democrats
Why
said
is that creepy? I'm not sure.
It means that it's not always good, at least from the Democrats' perspective. But I think that the behind-the-scene machinations are really interesting because it worked. This was a Christmas miracle. The idea that they could do this in 3 months, something that they couldn't do in 3 decades, shows that this is a blueprint for how to do it. Get everybody off campus, keep them away from the press, talk it through amongst yourselves until you understand how you're going to try to sell it, which is what they did. And somehow when they emerged from Fort McNair, which was the off-campus site, they got it done.
Look, credit for simply the legislative lift it took to get it passed by Christmas, but I think it's a mistake to assume this is a blueprint they can replicate. Here's why. First of all, President Trump, very conversant about taxes, at least compared to health care. That's right. Second of all, tax cuts are catechism to conservatives. You don't vote against tax cuts if you want to have an R after your name in Congress. And they got the Freedom Caucus and the normally disparate folks on board early. That was partly tactical. Certainly it helped get the bill passed. But I think this was something unique. They needed the win. They had the deadline. And you don't vote against tax cuts. We'll see what the impact is, but I'm not sure this is transferable to, say, entitlement reform in the spring.
And I would say, I do think they pay a price for the privacy of the process, that this is something that we saw Republicans use to great effect against Democrats in Obamacare, right? That this was passed in private, this was negotiated away from the American people, which wasn't entirely true that year, right? But when you see the opinion polling on this bill, people don't believe they will get a tax cut, even though in many cases they will. The basic sales job that you would expect there to be around a major piece of legislation simply hasn't happened yet, right? Yeah. So that all needs to happen now, and Republicans are playing catch-up in a way that they might not be if there had been a more public process.
Let's talk about a potential government shutdown. This could then Friday undo everything we've all.
I'm not falling for it. I'm sorry. I'm not. This is what they do. I'm not falling for it. They do this, and at the 11th hour, invariably at 11:59 p.m., they pass some sort of stopgap measure. They kick the can down the road for weeks or months, and that's what always happens. Is this different this time? Should I see it differently?
Look. Mitch McConnell assured everybody, no shutdown. I guarantee no shutdown. Well, that's exactly what he said before the last shutdown. Boehner was saying the same thing. Now, the difference is President Obama's not in the White House. The incentive for Republicans with unified control of Washington to actually shut the government down is pretty minimal. But this is the problem about sort of playing chicken, tricycling towards a cliff, is that sometimes you can slip over unintentionally.
Well, and on the Democratic side, too, that you have seen the Democrats back away from their red line, which is that there had to be a DACA fix by the end of the year or you wouldn't get Democratic votes on spending legislation. They're no longer saying that. And that's a very significant cave. And it means that, I think they are looking at this game of chicken and saying, you know what, we don't really want to be holding the bag for a shutdown, even if it is on a matter of principle for us.
You know the people who care the most about this? They live in the Florida Keys and on the Texas coast and in Puerto Rico, because there's an $80 billion aid package in there. And that is part of a slow motion disaster mitigation plan that is absolutely needed.
No, and you've done phenomenal reporting out of there and repeated, but that is important. That is a key provision. And why would you hold that up? Forget that it's on the eve of Christmas, just on principle. I mean, there are other outstanding items too. Children's health insurance is set to expire. Congress has kicked the can. So there are things they need to do to step up and just do their basic job that transcends politics.
Right.
John Avlon, Alex Burns, thank you.
Stick around. We have much more to talk about with you both. But now let's shift to the investigation into that deadly Amtrak derailment, now focusing on driver distraction and lack of experience. The National Transportation Safety Board reveals that two people, the engineer and conductor, unfamiliar with the territory, were in the cab when that disaster happened. CNN's Stephanie Elam, live in DuPont, Washington, with the very latest. Stephanie, good morning.
Good morning, Bill. And just a little bit more about those two people inside of the cab at the time of this derailment. We know one was the engineer and the other was a conductor who was getting more familiar with this terrain, which the NTSB says is part of the duties of a conductor. The other conductor, who was really working this train, and there's always one on each train, was in the section with the passengers at the time. We also learned that all of the crew members who were on this train have been hospitalized, and so the NTSB is hoping to interview those crew members within the next couple of days or so. They say they're trying to respect their injuries, but also make sure that they get their information. The other thing we learned, the emergency brake was not activated by the engineer. It was activated automatically on the train, and because this was the maiden voyage of this new route, they also made it clear that for 2 weeks they've been running non-revenue trains on this line. So while this was the first run with passengers on it, it was not the first run ever that they had done with this train. Of course, though, with two people being in the cab, they are looking at distraction as one of the issues that could have played a part here in what happened. They said that there are two cameras, one that faces inside the train cab and one that faces out. Both of them were severely damaged, and they're sending them back to their labs. The NTSB is sending them back to their labs in D.C. so they can see if they can extricate any of that video that might help give them some clues as to what happened. And also, just to let you know that two of the people have been identified, Allison, in this train accident, James Hamry and Zach Wilhoit. Both of them were train enthusiasts. Both of them, of course, excited about this new route, were on that train and lost their lives.
Oh, that's terrible, Stephanie. What a tragedy for you. Next.
I'm Christine Romans.
I'm Dave Briggs. This just in, Joe Biden has finally stopped praising the president. I think he had to sleep at some point, so it just now came to a close. It's Thursday, December 21st. It's 4 a.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in Seoul. It's 11 a.m. in Jerusalem. We'll check in there shortly. We start, though, with the Republicans taking a victory lap for passing their tax reform, tax cut bill, which now just awaits the president's signature. But in touting the bill as a huge tax cut, the president himself made what could be a serious tactical error, admitting the measure was just as much about gutting Obamacare.
The individual mandate is being repealed. So in this bill, not only do we have massive tax cuts and tax reform, we have essentially repealed Obamacare. We didn't want to bring it up. I told people specifically, be quiet with the fake news media because I don't want them talking too much about it, because I didn't know how people would. But now that it's approved, I can say the individual mandate has been repealed.
It is important to note Obamacare has not been repealed. Those GOP efforts failed this year. It is the individual mandate that has been repealed, stuck in this tax bill, and it may destabilize Obamacare by reducing the incentive for young, healthy people to buy insurance. The Congressional Budget Office has said repealing just the individual mandate will likely raise premiums to help cover older, sicker people, but it will also save the government money as people drop out of the subsidized Obamacare marketplaces.
By admitting the tax bill was a vehicle for hurting Obamacare, the president also handed Democrats potentially a powerful talking point for 2018. None of that got in the way of the Republicans' love fest yesterday, one which I misquoted, saying Joe Biden was praising the president. That, of course, was the man you see there, Mike Pence. Even with funding for the government set to run out tomorrow, latest, let's bring in CNN's Abby Phillip from the White House.
Well, Christine and Dave, the president and Republicans were jubilant at the White House with the passage of the first major legislative victory of his administration. The president talked a lot about the corporate tax rate going down and the money that will be coming back home from overseas. But Republicans had nothing but praise for him and his leadership, getting them over the finish line on this bill. Take a listen.
Something this profound could not have been done without exquisite presidential leadership.
This has been a year of extraordinary accomplishment for the Trump administration.
And we're going to make this the greatest presidency that we've seen, not only in generations, but maybe ever.
President Donald Trump delivered a great victory for the American people.
We're all friends. I mean, I look at these people, it's like we're warriors together.
But the battle for Republicans may still be ahead, with just a third of Americans supporting the tax bill that they just passed. And about 66% of Americans say that the middle class will not benefit as much as the wealthy. The White House is fully aware that they have a little bit more work to do to sell this bill, Christine and Dave. That's going to be next on the agenda for President Trump.
All right, Abby, thank you. The president has yet to sign that tax bill, but companies wasted no time announcing plans to pass some of their big tax savings to their employees, supporting the claim that corporate tax cuts will help workers. The bill cuts the corporate rate to 21% from 35%. Two banks, Wells Fargo and Fifth Third, say they will hike their minimum wages to $15 an hour. Comcast and AT&T promised $1,000 bonuses to more than 300,000 employees. Banks and telecoms will be two of the biggest winners of a lower tax rate. Both industries pay high effective tax rates. Banks alone could see their profits jump maybe 25%. While AT&T CEO Randall Stephenson praised the bill in a statement congratulating both Congress and the president, AT&T is currently being sued by the government to block its takeover of Time Warner, the parent company of CNN. Corporate America will benefit from tax cuts along with other policies of the pro-business Trump administration, like cutting regulations. When announcing its bonus, Comcast mentioned both the tax cut and the FCC's repeal of net neutrality. And boosting military spending, Boeing plans to invest $300 million on worker training and updating facilities.
You mentioned a lot of companies there. Are you surprised by that? I mean,
I was surprised by how quickly, and I'll tell you
not
something.
Not a lot of CEOs raised their hand a few weeks ago.
And they said that they would go, the assumption would be that much of the savings would go to shareholders and investors. To see those companies so quickly come out and say that they'd be giving $1,000 bonuses to their workers, I think was really interesting. The critics would say, that those are the PR departments trying to stay in the good graces of the Republican-led, Congress and the president. But for those workers, it's real money.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
To quote Joe Biden accurately this time. Less than 48 hours to go before funding runs dry and the federal government shuts down and no deal in sight. House Republicans frustrated after a closed-door meeting last night, members giving widely differing accounts of a proposal that's being cobbled together to keep the government running past midnight Friday on especially thorny issues, whether to add to a stopgap bill a 3-week extension of the mass surveillance program that collects intelligence on non-U.S. citizens.
Looming on the Senate side, the GOP's failure to deliver for Susan Collins. The Maine Republican received assurances from Majority Leader Mitch McConnell that she would get a vote on 2 Obamacare stabilization bills in exchange for her yes vote on the tax bill, which repealed, of course, the individual mandate. But Congress will leave town for the holidays without voting on Obamacare funding.
For the Republicans, the afterglow of the tax reform victory could wear off if they don't pass a spending plan. A new CNN poll shows voters prefer Democrats by an